This is the Multi-Faith Matters podcast. I'm your host, John Moorhead. I'm John Moorhead, and this is the Multi-Faith Matters podcast. And I'm privileged today to have as my guest Ethan Stark. And I don't have a whole lot of introductory material on Ethan, so I'm going to first welcome him to the podcast. Welcome, and thanks for coming, Ethan.
Oh, thank you for having me, John.
Yeah, I've got very little notes here in terms of what I was able to dig up on you personally and your background. You have a pagan background in specifically heathenry. You're involved in multi-faith work. Interfaith work, and you're also involved in a group that is just fascinating to me, Heathens Against Hate. So we want to unpack all of that. Before we begin that, can you give me a little more background other than here's Ethan Stark and he's a pagan and a heathen?
Well, I was born on December 17th, 1983.
Really 83? You are so young.
Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, there's some gray that's slowly coming in here. You know, I get that big 40 is right around the corner.
All right.
I grew up. I grew up in Israel, actually, and I grew up in conservative Judaism, and it wasn't until like the age of approximately 13 where I kind of really started to develop a sense of, this may not be for me, and kind of traverse the world of the world religion, so to speak. And I found Wicca at 13. That's sort of like the introductory of earth-centered spiritualities for a lot of people. And throughout the years, I kind of realized that Wicca was an amalgamation of many different traditions in and of themselves. And so delving a little bit more into those particulars, I kind of zeroed in eventually on heathenry, also known as Asatru or Germanic paganism. Mm-hmm. And that really was what I gravitated towards in terms of the folklore and in terms of those northern traditions. And so I started getting involved in that, and in part of that involvement, I became a member of the Troth, which is one of the largest international heathen organizations, and an inclusive one at that. And through the Troth, I managed to sort of gain a lot of knowledge and a lot of resources, and eventually became active within the organization. And I currently sit on their board of directors, as well as being their clergy liaison. And it was through the Troth and through their work that I eventually became involved with Heathens Against Hate, which kind of started as a blog at first back in, I think, 2008. And then eventually it sprung up as a movement and eventually had to be codified as an organization. And that kind of brings us to today. A lot of the background that I have in interfaith work, a lot stems through my personal life. My wife is a practicing Lutheran Christian with the ELCA, and with my background being Jewish and having lived abroad in a very non-homogeneous environment, if you will, in terms of religious space, as well as some of the dissension and conflict that is associated with the Middle East, it kind of makes a person aware of stuff like that. And so it was very much something that I kind of took with me. And coming to pagan circles, I also had to kind of examine how things were structured and how, what I liked, what I didn't like, any kind of behavioral patterns that I didn't really, I disagreed with or I had a problem with. And so I kind of decided to really make it my mission to, when I go to different events or when I, present myself to certain people, um, I am unabashedly a proud pagan polytheist, but I am also very much in tune and understanding where I came from, who my friends and family are, and understanding that that broad stroke of a brush cannot be applied to everyone, and everybody is a unique individual that deserves attention. And so a lot of interfaith work kind of, I think, deals with that. It kind of brings differences as uniquenesses to the foreground that kind of dispel some of the myth that surround the big picture of whatever faith tradition a person is. And and that kind of brings us to today.
Well, part of your response anticipates my next question. One of the things I like to do in this podcast is not just about ideas. Unfortunately, Protestant evangelicalism is really about doctrine, belief, ideas, disagreement with others, this kind of thing. And all of that has its place and it's important, but these ideas are embedded in people's lives. It's about our journeys, our different spiritual journeys that we take. And you mentioned a little bit about that when you talked about your bio, but what was it personally that you were looking for, that you encountered within heathenry that you found so appealing that you adopted as your own particular spiritual pathway?
A lot of that, it kind of developed in gradation. It wasn't something that it wasn't an epiphany. It wasn't some sort of revelation. A lot of pagans would probably have similar experiences where they gravitated toward a particular idea of what they wanted out of a faith tradition or out of a spiritual pathway, and kind of started going down that stream, collecting different things along the way of things that gravitated and appealed to them. For me, it was Tolkien. When I read Lord of the Rings, I was so excited by all that mythic motif that he wove in that I was curious. I'm like, where did he get all this stuff from? And so when I found out that, Tolkien was a linguist at Oxford University, he traveled to Iceland, he studied Old Norse and the sagas, and I suddenly realized, wow, like this is based off of something that was written hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before, that are probably based on older sources that are since lost to the innumerable ages. And so I started then, I picked that up and I moved forward with that. And eventually I discovered my affinity was to these stories that I later discovered were attributed to particular people that lived in particular times that had their own set of spirituality, which it was an oral tradition, so it was lost for the most part due to time, assimilation, conversion, be it willful or coerced, and so I realized that there are groups nowadays in the 21st century that are slowly reconstructing it from whatever fragmentary information is out there, and so that allowed me to retain a degree of mystery and also have agency in how I craft my religious beliefs. Because a lot of the times, when I grew up and I went to synagogue, I always tell this story when I sit in synagogue and I look at the rabbi and or multiple rabbis up by the tabernacle carrying the Torah or reading from the Torah or speaking their sermon or whatnot, and I always had a disconnect, and I was thinking to myself, what makes this person special that he gets to be up there closer, in air quotes, closer to God? I didn't feel God there. I didn't feel divinity. I didn't feel connected spirituality. I wanted an intimate connection. And I found that intimate connection through heathenry by the fact that I not only managed to connect to these stories, much like people connect to stories in the Bible or stories in the Holy Quran or whatnot, but also be a part of the reformation of the religion, and that's something that, I'm sure maybe Protestants may have felt that same way during the great disconnect from the Catholic Church. We now have these brand new novel and, some people might say heretical ideas, but we're still going to go with it because we feel closer to the aspect of the divine in our lives through this particular course. And so that's why heathenry is often termed an orthopraxic religion. We value correct practice over correct belief because we don't have a holy scripture, we don't have any dogma, and we don't have a particular system. And because we're so decentralized, we're relying on practice and our own personal practice. And that degree of intimacy is what ultimately led me to fall in love with heathenry.
Well, it's fascinating that a Catholic writer led you to, at least provided some of the stepping stones into heathenry. That's fascinating. If I have any Catholic listeners, they're probably tune out after this. But it's just an interesting thing how things develop in people's lives. I first heard about your work through a YouTube video, a dialogue that you had with Pastor, I hope I'm going to pronounce his name correctly, Andy Berendt.
Andy Berendt, yes.
Yeah, of Trinity Lutheran. Is it Wapaka? Is that how you pronounce it?
Wapaka.
Wapaka. Boy, I'm just mispronouncing everything.
It's fine. Wisconsin place names are often difficult to pronounce.
How did you and the pastor happen to connect and develop the relationship and have the dialogue?
I've actually known Pastor Andy as a lot more of an acquaintance, really. He was a good friend of my wife's family. And when my wife and I were getting serious about getting married, we had to figure out what an interfaith household would look like, what it would be like to be present in each other's practices, which are, let's be real, very opposite sides of the spectrum, monotheism on one side, polytheism on the other. And so we realized that we had different thoughts and different visions of what we wanted, not just our household to be, but also when we were kind of crafting our wedding ceremony. There are things that I cannot say and oblige an oath to. I cannot oath to Jesus Christ because I am not a Christian. I cannot receive communion. And so we brought in Pastor Andy, who was a good friend of her family's, and we eventually realized that we wanted an interfaith wedding. And in our wedding, we had Pastor Andy Berendt and my good friend Kurt Holman both presiding. And Kurt was our heathen clergy, and Pastor Andy was right beside him, and they were kind of sharing roles. They each had designated roles that they played. And then that was the first time that Andy and I ever connected. And that was the first time he had ever experienced or had any exposure to heathenry or paganism in general. And so he was really excited. And he was speaking to Kurt a lot. And then eventually he and I began talking. And I realized that he is somebody who is very devoted to his mission in the ELCA, but he's also very receptive to other faith traditions, understanding that religion does not exist in a vacuum, and many religions influence and play off each other. And so through our discussions, I eventually realized that he would be somebody really good to bring into a project that I was doing. And back in 2018, I participated through Heathens Against Hate with the Parliament of the World's Religion back up. It was held in Toronto. And so I did a presentation there. And I decided since then, every single one that I would attend, which they happen every 3 or 4 years, I would present and do something. And so the past Parliament, I asked Andy, hey, would you want to have a conversation? Because one of the things that has been tearing a lot, or one of the most troubled relationships that exist in both the Christian and the pagan community, is the Christian-pagan relationship, with a lot of people, tending to generalize things, tend to kind of, faith bash others. And a lot of pagans come from an Abrahamic background, mostly Christian. And so I thought it was really important to have this conversation. And me not being a Christian, I can't talk about it. I'm not authorized to. I know nothing both theologically or practically on the religion, other than what I've seen by going to church with my wife or whatnot. So Andy was really excited about it. And he and I sat down and we started figuring out, well, what kind of points we talk about, because talking about religion is even the most basic concept. And as you have seen in that talk, like we were talking about divinity, ecology, and humanity, and even those are broad that can be talked about for years, solely on those subjects. So we work to try and concise ourselves and try to see what we can do in order to hit the really good points that will allow people to at least latch on to those points where we can have that discussion and further that discussion in the future. And so that discussion that you saw on YouTube was essentially our preamble and our public preamble, essentially, to the discussion that we were having for people who attended Parliament.
Okay. Have those dialogues continued, and has the congregation been involved?
The congregation was involved during the Q&A, which you may have seen in that video. I've since received several feedback from several congregants since that discussion, both when I was visiting Wapaka again, and Pastor Andy is really a pillar of the community there. So it's kind of hard to be in public with Pastor Andy, sort of like the celebrity of Wapaka, where people just stop by, say hello, and some of them did manage to introduce themselves, saying, hey, I sat down during your discussion, because this was at a time where, even though we were on stage without masks, everybody else was masked in the congregation. So I didn't recognize faces at the time. So I did speak with a few people, but since then, things kind of, we let things simmer, and I've been trying to figure out how to move from there. Like, how do we continue the conversation without rehashing the conversation? And that's something I'm working on right now, because I'm currently gearing up to attempt to present at the next Parliament, which is, I'm happy to say, in August of 2023 in Chicago. So if you have a chance to fly up and attend, I highly recommend it. Shameless plug. But yeah, that's I am looking forward to continue the conversation. So right now I'm just trying to figure out exactly how.
Yeah, I'd love the opportunity to attend. I led a grant team of 3 evangelical Christian pastors and 3 evangelical scholars called Multi-Faith Matters, which is what this podcast and organization was birthed out of. And we met periodically in different locations for the team members. And I'm in the greater Salt Lake City area. And we had the meeting here in Salt Lake at the time when the Parliament was meeting in Salt Lake. And so our team was able to go, and we didn't present any panels or anything, but we had several team members had relationships with those in the pagan community who were there. And so we met for dinner. And I would like to think we may have set a record for the largest number of Christians and pagans together. In one instance, we had 6 of us evangelicals, and we must have had about 20 pagans or something. And it was a great time. It was fascinating because not all of our team has familiarity with dialogue with pagans. One is very active in dialogue with the Muslim and Jewish communities. He's very comfortable in that environment. And I watched him that evening, and he was very uncomfortable with the pagans. So it was insightful for me, because just because one is comfortable in one interfaith arena or context doesn't translate to everything, that there are some unique specifics about that kind of thing. But I would love an opportunity to, be a part of that, what's going on in Chicago. It'd be nice to put together some kind of formal, pagan Christian dialogue kind of thing. If I don't know if that's what you said you were trying to put that together.
Yeah, I'm trying to ruminate on how I can get this a little bit larger, because the conversation I initially wanted to present to Parliament, because I initially spoke to Phyllis Curott, who is one of the managing directors of Parliament, who is also a very well-known Wiccan priestess, and she and I were conversing back and forth on what we wanted, on how I could better craft this. And the initial idea was to actually get a multi-faith panel of having a Lutheran minister, a Catholic bishop, or a Catholic priest, a Muslim cleric, a Sikh. We wanted a lot more than just pagan Christian, because a lot of the tensions that are under discussion in the pagan Christian dynamic is very true on the pagan or the polytheistic monotheistic dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And so getting the big monotheistic religions, that being Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and Sikhism as well, is one of those. It's one of those ideas that I wanted to float out, but I didn't have any connection. Regrettably, I know very few Muslims, especially here now that I'm in Wisconsin, and we want to kind of take that same platform of a panel discussion that's kind of centered around particular topics, and kind of almost do like a panel TED talk of sorts, where there's a lot more Q&A with the audience. And regrettably, Parliament only gave us 45 minutes for our presentation, which is not nearly enough just for a pagan and a Christian, yet alone a panel of 4, faith leaders. So it's trying to condense a lot in a very small amount of time.
Well, I have had the dialogue with pagans here on the podcast before, but we haven't had anybody from Heathenry. And could you say a little bit to that about what it's about, maybe some of its uniqueness? I want, especially the Christians who are listening and watching this podcast, I'm not using heathen in the old Christian sense of a disparaging term for anyone who's a non-Christian. It has a specific referent within your tradition. Can you speak to that?
Correct. And thank you for mentioning that. Usually I kind of lead that with my elevator pitch there, that heathen, while it has been used in a pejorative sense, modern heathens nowadays have opted to create it as an approbative, similar to how Lutherans or Lutheran was a pejorative back in the day, and then Lutherans or evangelicals were like, you know what? No, we're going to take that and we're going to call ourselves Lutheran because we're proud of that disconnect. But heathenry, essentially, also known as Asatru or Germanic paganism, is essentially a pagan or polytheistic belief in or reconstruction of the beliefs of the Germanic people that once inhabited central and northern and insular parts of Europe. So a lot of the mythology that you're familiar with of, the god Odin or Thor or Freya or Frigg, Loki, like those deities that we're familiar with, from comic books to any other pop culture reference, those are part of the pantheon that is specifically relegated to the quote unquote Germanic pantheon. There are many others. Some of them are a little bit more obscure. And heathenry is as I mentioned before, is a decentralized orthopraxic religion. So a lot of the religion is considered a reconstructionist religion, where our religion is very much a religion of study, where we focus a lot on academic, folkloric, philological, and linguistic resources to kind of build a foundation that's rooted in what we know of the Germanic people, and kind of, build it up a little bit more that fits in the 21st century. Because let's face it, things that we know occurred back in the day cannot occur, nowadays. We've we have about a couple thousand years of doing things different. So a lot of the heathenry in pop culture or heathen iconography that you often come across mainly is you'll see the Thor's hammer, which has become a synonymous symbol of our faith. It's a symbol of consecration, and it's a symbol of protection. And Thor's hammers have been found throughout Scandinavia and continental Europe, made from bone, wood, stone, amber, and that kind of became part of our faith. Obviously, a lot of people in like the heavy metal community often also wear Thor's hammers, because there's Viking metal and folk metal that kind of adopts a lot of the symbology and a lot of the iconography of Germanic folklore. And so that kind of, you'll sometimes, that kind of seeped into that. Runes, which is a system of writing that has been used for commemorative inscription and calendar making, is also a very popular symbol that you may see. And the most famous act that you normally see is people raising horns, which are literally like, cattle horns that are often filled with mead or other kind of alcoholic libation, although nowadays it could very much be non-alcoholic. And you would kind of see that in a ceremonial fashion. And so heathenry is essentially the celebration and the reverence and the honoring of gods, of nature spirits, and of ancestors. And important to specify, ancestors can be both ancestors of blood, meaning kinship, your grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on and so forth, but also ancestors beyond your blood, people that are worthy of honor, people that had existed that are worthy of honor, who may not be connected to you genetically or biologically or whatnot. But those are kind of the primary things that heathens often revere in their spiritual practice.
Well, I've interacted, as I've said before, with a number of pagans in dialogue, and I'm familiar with pagan Christian dialogue and dialogue with that pagans do with other traditions. But you were the first heathen that I've encountered in this. Is it fair to say that there aren't many heathens doing dialogue, or is it just not as well known? And can you then talk a little bit about the kind of dialogue work that you're doing?
So one of my biggest criticisms about paganism, and especially about heathenry, is that we're very insular. And that has been born both out of a mistrust, but also born out of certain practices. Mistrust because a lot of us are, by Christian accounts, apostates. We've renounced we've renounced our previous faith, be it if we were Jewish or Christian or whatnot, in favor of another that we had found that we connect to. Nowadays, we actually are coming up to the point where we do have generational heathens, which is good to see, that are born into heathenry. But many of us are not. Many of us were born and raised in different religions. So when we leave a faith, we oftentimes leave it with either unanswered questions or, like, like disgruntled teenagers, we often leave in a huff. And so we have, sometimes we may have unresolved issues that might be very valid issues, but unresolved nonetheless. And so that could create distrust. The other is out of practice. What heathens do mainly, one of the most sacred things that we do is we commit ourselves to oath taking. And in heathenry, oath taking is a very serious and sacred act, in the sense of anybody who observes it is tied and bound to it. So if I were to make an oath myself and you were to hear it, you are bound and under obligation that I fulfill that. And that's something that can only be done in circles of great trust. And so a lot of heathen practice revolves around these circles of trust. And while that is very good to form these circles, that also creates isolationism. And that's why, unfortunately, a lot of fortunately and unfortunately, the fortunate part of this is that we've taken a lot of our time and energy into formulating our practice and developing our practice and finding more ways to add, omit, and change based on, like I said before, like historical findings and whatnot. And so we are building ourselves a good foundations, and we are focused on our work as heathens. But the downside to that is that we have not developed enough focus outward and enough attention to educate the outside world on what heathenry is and does. And that, unfortunately is the chickens are coming home to roost. A lot of people are taken aback. They don't know much about heathenry, and unfortunately, due to certain current events these past several years, heathenry has sometimes come in the foreground in the shadow of white supremacy, and that's something that is even more so prompting myself and others to get out there and get into interfaith spaces and educate more on heathenry, so that a more wholesome and more inclusive understanding be brought to light.
Yeah, it's if it's any consolation, I don't know that heathenry is the only insulated religious community. I think there's just a natural human tendency. We focus on our own lives, our own religious community. And I think folks like you and I are probably more the exception than the rule, in that, we really want to deep dive not only within our own traditions, but we also have an outward focus. We want to understand others. We want to have the dialogue, and we're constantly pulling members of our own community into those liminal spaces to try and encounter others. So, but I do appreciate the dynamics, the special dynamics that pagans and heathens have encountered that added extra layer of difficulty to that process. Now, you mentioned white supremacy and that type of thing, which leads to the natural question. You're doing this interfaith work. You're also with an organization called Heathens Against Hate, which to me is fascinating. Can you talk to that and how your interfaith work, in my experience, my interfaith or multi-faith work has both internal and external dynamics to it. And many times it's the internal dynamics, it's the intra-faith that is more challenging for me than the interfaith. I oftentimes have an easier time interacting, whether it's a pagan, Satanist, Muslim, and I get pushback and blowback from members of my own community who think I'm liberal, compromising, not being faithful, et cetera. Maybe I'm not even a true Christian, kind of a thing. I would imagine that you experience even more intense dynamics in those regards. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, so there's, through my work through Heathens Against Hate, where we've formed ourselves as a education religious organization to create better awareness on inclusive practices in heathenry, because the big pink elephant in the room in heathenry is the fact that a lot of American heathenry was born out of a very exclusionary, very bigoted, and very racist foundation. And it took several years until like the early 90s where there was a schism of sorts. And in heathenry, you would often find two camps, the inclusive and the folkish, coming from the German Völkisch, meaning of the folk or of the people. Folkish heathenry specifically has the caveat that in order to belong, you have to be of European descent, aka white, which puts a genetic marker on whether or not you can belong to a religion, something that Mathias in his book Gods of the Blood termed the biologization of spirituality. And that's essentially what folkish heathenry does. And inclusive heathenry is exactly counter to that. We don't care. It doesn't matter because the gods call to whomever, and you cannot put any kind of marker on it. And so that's kind of the work the Heathens Against Hate does, is that we're bringing, we're kind of shining a light to not just the differences, but also to our own problems within our own tradition. And every faith tradition on this planet has some form of extremity, and for us, it's white supremacy, which has co-opted our symbols, the same symbols that I mentioned earlier. After Charlottesville in 2016, we saw an influx of all those symbols, being put forth by the National Socialist Movement in the United States, that even switched their main logo from a swastika to one of our runes. And so that's, people have no idea what these symbols are. But guess who carries most of those symbols? We do. Mm-hmm. And so we have to then explain, before we can even explain heathenry, some people actually have to, take a few steps back and say, first of all, I'm not racist, and then develop a kind of better rapport. And it's kind of really confusing and to the detriment of everything that occurred up until this point. But to the effect of pushback from my own community, you are 100% correct on that, because there's a lot of things that I've encountered, both within people that have supported or initially supported Heathens Against Hate. Some people thought that we were too soft because we also believe in rehabilitation. A lot of our work that we try to do, we model or try to model or put as an exemplar with the work of Life After Hate, which is a great nonprofit that is comprised of and founded by former extremists to reform extremists who leave the movement. Something that takes years, something that takes a lot of time, effort, blood, sweat, and tears to do. And we believe in that. And some people thought that we're being too apologetic, that, Nazis only deserve to be punched. Right. And it's something that while I don't subscribe necessarily to the doctrine of turning the other cheek, I do subscribe to the doctrine of compassion. And there is a way of dispensing compassion. And sometimes there are people that choose not to receive it, and so I will dispense it elsewhere. But ultimately, we want to show compassion by allowing people to have the option of working to opt out. And that especially comes to people who come into heathenry, who initially might gravitate towards these exclusionary and racist groups because they're loud and they're boisterous, and you know what? They sell a pretty good package, or at least it's an attractive one until you realize that there's nothing but a dark void in there. And so we kind of want to say, hey, you can have a community and you can have a voice and you can have this beautiful faith tradition without all the hate baggage. without exclusionary practice. And so people within my own community some of them have pushed against it. And some of the people have definitely pushed against me after I've said it once in a podcast previous, and I'll say it again now. And for all the pagan listeners, especially heathens, you might disagree with this statement. But I used to believe that exclusionary heathens or folkish heathens are not heathen. And that is an inaccurate statement to make from a religious perspective. They believe the same things that we do. They honor the same gods that we do. They even worship in similar manner that we do, with the exception of their extremist ideology that's attached. While that extremist ideology is not something that has ever been a part of our religion, to say that they're not and completely, kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, you can't do that. So unfortunately, yes, they are heathens. We have to count them in our religious category, and we have to understand that this is a part of our religious category that we have to work with, and we have to accept. We have to accept that there are people that have their own ideas, even if those ideas are things that we vehemently disagree with. And so a lot of the pushback that I've received as of late has been that. And it also has been my conversation with Christians, because there is a lot of religious trauma that occurs now. And I have no degree in psychology. I don't know how to deal with it. I only know that I can understand, respect, and hope that I can somehow reach people in a certain way that allows them to at least examine that. Because a lot of people have, much like other Christians who are not familiar with heathenry or with paganism, tend to paint us with a broad stroke. I even posted something recently on Facebook about an article that was very ranty that was written on Mathias Pagan, which is a pagan blog of sorts where people can submit writings, and this author just went on and on and she was painting a lot of Christianity with a really broad stroke of a brush, with no background into, even basic background into Christian theology. And so it wasn't a critique, because critiques are thoughtful. They think critically and ask pertinent questions. This was just a blab of discontent. And while I understand the discontent, we can't live in that discontent. We have to move beyond it. And so the biggest pushback that I received in my community is that of a lot of visceral reactions against Christians, and me trying my best to kind of show, at least through my own experience of interacting with Christians, especially, in an intimate setting such as a marriage, for instance, how you cannot have blanketed statements, and you can't say, well, Christians did this, so they must be bad, or they must yada yada yada, because that's exactly what is being leveled against heathens and pagans by Christians who also have a limited understanding. So it's just kind of, we're mudslinging at this point, and it's just a matter of trying to kind of put a wall in between and be like, hey, stop, let's put let's clean our muddy hands for a minute and sit down and talk.
Yeah, I think that is a helpful reminder for Christians who are watching and listening to be mindful of the trauma, the perceptions, pagans who've experienced it themselves, or after becoming a pagan, they've kind of adopted that as the narrative of the relationship between Christianity and paganism and those kinds of things. We just have to be receptive to it. I also appreciate something of what you said. It swerved into the no true Scotsman fallacy, right? And every religious community does it. The Muslims don't care for the terrorists. That's not true Islam. We Christians will say, well, those who go into an African American church and engage in a shooting or whatever, that's not a true Christian. And I don't hold to this essentialized definition of religion. It's not this objective thing out there. It is as it is lived, whether in good ways or bad ways. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to tap into the best of our religious traditions, recognizing the darkness is there to overcome those challenges. With that in mind, what are some of the tools and the resources that you as a heathen tap into, both in your interfaith work and in your combating extremism?
Well, the main resource in any of a situation like that is information, right? And disseminating that information properly and to the right people. A lot of what we do, at least with Heathens Against Hate, what we try to do is we have some prison in reach where we try to reach people in prison, because prisons are the hotbed of racism and extremism in the United States, at least, and a place where it's already segregated and it's already different with its own set of culture and rules or whatnot. But when people who are incarcerated get out, sometimes they get out with whatever they were indoctrinated in prison, and sometimes that kind of, something in prison transforms them. People find religion in prison. What religion they find and in what state they find it in is literally based upon whatever material makes it into their hands. So that's one element, and that's something that honestly carries over to anything else, even outside of institutions, where you want to get proper information out. So for instance, if someone says, well, heathenry is based off of Central or the Germanic people of Central and Northern Europe, so, they were white. So in essence, like this is, I don't understand why a person of color would want to partake in that religion. While it's true that it may have developed there is no attestation in any sources. And actually, to the contrary, there's more attestation of cross-cultural involvement in ancient times than there is cultural exclusion. So there's actually like a lot of evidence to the contrary. But regardless of that, even if we want to throw away the information out there that, it never happened in antiquity, and so it shouldn't happen today, the ultimate fact is that we, again, are a decentralized religion. We are a Reconstructionist religion. So those are two things. So with the Reconstructionist religion, that means that we have the responsibility to build things in the 21st century. And that means that we put our own feelings, our own emotions, our own responses to our current society. So if you build something that says only white people get to join, that has nothing to do with anything in antiquity. It has nothing to do with the religion itself. It has to do with your personal biases. And that is, and that's like the main key point that we're trying to make, is that you don't have to add that in there. There's nothing that says that you should. Well, there's nothing that says that you shouldn't either. But the fact that you're choosing says nothing about the faith and more about you as a person. And so part of the tools that we try to implement is kind of seeing those things. The other thing that we're trying to, or I'm personally trying to do, is, one of the things that in pagan circles has always cropped up when there's a pagan Christian discussion, is to say, well, Christians are responsible for the Inquisition and for the Puritan burning times in early American history, and they were responsible for killing our witch ancestors or so on and so forth. That's true, but it's it's a fallacy to go ahead and equate the larger aspect of it. It's sort of like the same thing of, you wouldn't accuse, and I'm going to use this very abrasive example, and I apologize for anybody who is a German listener, but it's almost like accusing modern day Germans for the Third Reich. They had nothing to do with it. Mm-hmm. They're German by nationality. Are you going to put all of German people as Nazis? Germans are ashamed of that period in their history. Mm-hmm. They recognize it. They're ashamed of it, and they've worked themselves to be better and make sure that that never, ever happens again. That is actually a very good lesson to take from it. Mm-hmm. And that's something that a lot of people should take from it as well, that people in pagan spaces understand, yes, Christianity has done so, but Christianity has also changed in the millennia that it's been in existence. The Christianity of the first to 6 or 7 centuries is a very different Christianity from the 16th and 17th, which is very different from the Christianity in 18th and to the 21st centuries. And even in that, I'm using Christianity in the broad sense. I'm not talking about denominations, which there are a whole slew of which. And so these are some of the critical things that we, or me myself, try to bring into the conversation with pagans, for them to understand that you can't just say, well, Christians are that. I like, a lot of people try to bring in personal things that they know about me, saying, well, how can you sit there and talk to a Christian who believes that my father's an openly gay man, like he believes that, like, how can you sit with somebody across the table who believes that your father's going to go to hell? And I tell them, my father doesn't believe that he's going to hell. My father doesn't care. Mm-hmm. If this person believes that my father is going to hell, I will ask them, what else do they believe? And then if they tell me that they believe in the love and compassion of Jesus Christ, my next question would be, well, which one is more important? Which one is stronger? Which one is the basis of your faith? Because quoting Leviticus until you're blue in the face is not the basis of your faith. And this is me speaking, obviously, as a non-Christian, but I've encountered enough Christian bigotry of my own to kind of try to see what I can deflect, or at least return with a question that makes a person kind of say, huh. So at the same token, pagans should do the same thing. If they level all these things against Christians, they should also examine why they're doing that in the first place. And if it comes from a place of trauma, then that is something that they need to deal with themselves, either professionally or either through lay counseling or through their friends, through their family, or through professionals, in order to have a healthier and more wholesome understanding of their own faith, so they're secure enough to not go out and bash somebody else's.
Well, you've had the experience over the years in these dialogue situations with Christians. Here you are on an evangelical Christian podcast. What kinds of takeaways would you like those viewers and listeners to take away from even some difficult truths, some things to remember, not just for pagans in general, but maybe even if there's some heathen specifics? What would you like us to take away from a conversation like this?
One of the main things that I'd like to take away, and I spoke about this at the conversation I had with Andy, my commandment theory, which the theory transcends whatever religion it is that is not Christian. But my commandment theory, based on a story, and people can see the talk in detail. But basically, the commandment theory is that a Christian remembers one of the main commandments of "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," and that's the first thing that comes to mind when encountering somebody of another faith, especially one that is antithetical to monotheism. to that particular commandment. And so the theory goes is that they think about this commandment and then think to themselves, am I in breach of that commandment by associating or speaking with this particular person who is not a Christian? And so that essentially would close that person off. They would not want to talk because they would not want to talk or converse or even try to not be curious about and kind of shun their eyes away, because they fear that they're in violation of that first commandment, and in turn violation of their relationship with God Almighty. And again, underline, bold, and italicize the word theory based on my personal experience. So this by no means is something that is dictated across the board, but it is something that I found curious. And so I would encourage the evangelical listeners who are good people of the book, who I'm sure have read it many times and are very familiar with Genesis and the commandments. I don't believe that you are in breach. I don't believe that neither your God nor his son would be angry with you to be open-minded and compassionate in getting an understanding of fellow human beings. Because if you also note in the Bible that the human race was created as one, it wasn't created in, we're going to create white people first, people of color second, poor countries last, rich countries first, or something like that. It was just creating humanity. And we are all in this same creation together. And I think, I really think that that your God and the God of your forebearers would relish you to reach out at least an understanding hand in finding some of his others in his creation.
Well, I think you're onto something with your theory. I mean, you mentioned earlier that you're not a psychologist. You haven't studied psychology. When we did some of our grant work, we did a little research in social psychology to understand the theology and praxis of conservative Christians when it comes to those and other religions. And I really think you're onto something. There is a concern that they will somehow become contaminated spiritually, they'll become impure, maybe even receive spiritual harm. And so there's this tendency to either shy away and not engage, or to be defensive to keep the possible infection, if you will, at bay. And one of the things we're trying to do is encourage Christians. Look, Jesus operated within a Jewish culture where purity concerns were dominant as a part of their religious outlook. But Jesus was willing to go and speak with the outcasts of his society, the lepers and those who were tax collectors and all of those things. And if we're to call Jesus, the leader of our religious tradition, then we ought to be willing to go to those kinds of spaces that he was willing to go to. So I think you're onto something. I tried to give a theological justification for what you're encouraging from your religious framework, but I think you're onto something there.
I believe you have more religious education than myself, so you can go ahead and dive into that for sure.
Well, as we draw our time to a close, you mentioned a book when you and I were conversing before we started recording the podcast. Can you mention that one again, and any other books that you would recommend for viewers and listeners to learn more about heathenry and paganism in general?
So with heathenry and paganism is such a large umbrella term that I can't even start on a particular book, because we are also broken up. It's sort of like if you had Christianity 101, like where would you go?
Right, exactly.
But more specifically to heathenry, the book that I mentioned earlier was American Heathens by Jennifer Snook. And she's a professor in Grinnell University, and she did the closest as she could census of American heathens in the United States, in terms of our numbers, in terms of the tradition and certain time of perspectives and beliefs that we hold. So that's a pretty interesting book to kind of get an idea more about us as a religious community. In terms of beliefs and practice or whatnot, there are a lot of beginner books. There's a beginner's guide to Asatru by an author by the name of Mathias Nordvig, as well as another one by Patricia Lafaylive. And if you see beginner's guide to Asatru and you put Patricia, you put Mathias, it should pop up. And if you want a bit more of an expansive volumes, and no shame, I'm plugging a bit of my organization here. Sure. But the Troth offers our Troth Volume 1 and Volume 2, which pretty thick volumes there. That Volume 1 kind of deals with the beliefs, and Volume 2 deals with the practice. But it becomes it is a little bit more detailed, but it is also very nicely cited by. Written and cited by multiple contributors, and compiled by one of our members, Ben Wagner. And so that is definitely something that a lot of people who start out in heathenry usually get accustomed to, and it deals with a lot of things that are sometimes gets even more esoteric. So it might be a little too much to chew, but a lot of these beginner books, and especially Jennifer's book, those are books that, they're fairly small volumes that can kind of get people to have a basic idea. And I did want to mention that when you were mentioning that whole idea of kind of spiritual ickiness or spiritual sickness or whatnot, it's important to understand that that's kind of it's an understandable feeling from the perspective of, like, religion is so huge on our identity, and we are very covetous of our identity because we feel that if we lose it, we would be nothing. Mm-hmm. And identity, much like ogres, it has layers. So religion is not everything you are, even though you put a lot of who you are into it. And so I think it's important that see how people layer their own religion onto themselves. I am not just a heathen. I am also a husband. I am also a welding student. I also belong to fraternities. I also belong to. I am also, love. I'm learning how to dance. In my 38 years, I hated dancing. Now I'm going and practicing ballroom dancing. There's a lot of
man than I.
I mean, my wife is a ballroom dance instructor. Okay. So, like, yoga is maybe on my docket too. Who knows? But, like, all these things kind of layer up into who Heathen is, and so kind of look at yourself and figure, like, who you are, and then look at somebody else. And if essentially you look at somebody else and be like, well, they are this. Remember that you are not just that, and so they are not just that. And so maybe by reconciling that, you realize that you can kind of chip away that feeling of sickness or ickiness or whatnot, because you're confident in your spirituality. And I'm sure that you can attest to this also in your interfaith work. People who are wholly confident in their beliefs are oftentimes more receptive to understanding others, because they don't feel that they'll be losing anything.
Yeah, I agree with that. I appreciate those suggestions there. There's this interest amongst scholars in psychology now to focus on intellectual humility. And the way they're defining it is the willingness to go into conversations admitting that you could be wrong in a lot of areas. I'm not comfortable with that, because in my experience with Christians who are willing to meet with Jews and pagans and Muslims and everything, it's not really, they're not going into it saying, gee, I think I'm wrong. It's really a humble confidence you're confident in your tradition. You recognize, yeah, along the way, I'm going to discover areas that I'm wrong, but you're humble in the process, and you're not afraid that you're going to get contaminated, or it's one human being meeting another and developing relationships, having conversations. And I think we need more of this humble confidence.
Yeah, I mean, we get heathens get the like, wait, you believe in Thor, like the comic book character? So like, we have to be humble and be like, okay, let me kind of swallow that a little bit,
right.
And then explain a little bit about it. So yeah, I mean, sometimes, yeah. So we both get a bit of flavors here and there of certain, certain kind of like, to talk about things truthfully, I think you have to be humble about them first.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you recommending those resources. I will, when I go back and add a little editing to this at the front and tail end, I will listen to that. And in the program notes, folks can find the Troth, Heathens Against Hate, and I'll try and find the links for those books that you recommend so that folks can seek them out. And
and if anybody has any questions, you can also add my website as well.
Okay.
And if people want to reach direct or whatnot, and I will definitely also continue the conversation with you, because I think you and I might be able to also work something out for this coming Parliament if you're able to make it.
I would love to do it. I don't know that you sent me the link to your, you did the Troth, and I found Heathens Against Hate. If you've got a personal website, if you would email me that and I can incorporate that into the notes, or is it through the Troth?
No, my personal website, it's hallowed renewal, all one word.com.
Okay.
And I'll give you all that stuff.
Okay. I will include that in the program notes as well. Again, my guest has been Ethan Stark. Ethan, thank you so much. I hope this is the first of many conversations.
Thank you very much. I look forward to more.